Most people wake to birdsong or the hum of a coffee maker. I woke to a dull, monstrous roar, an engine that sounded like a freight train with attitude. It shook loose the last thread of sleep and dragged me to the window. There it was, a new, glinting 2025 Ford Expedition plowing across the front lawn like the yard belonged to someone named Victory. Behind the wheel, sunglasses on, chewing gum silent, sat Evelyn March, our HOA president. Evelyn March, who wrote the neighborhood rules with an iron pen and enforced them like the law. Evelyn March, the woman who treated property lines the way toddlers treat finger paint, inconvenient, optional, hers to rework. At first I assumed it must be an accident, some delivery driver cutting too close. But the camera on my porch didn't lie. The footage showed Evelyn's profile, the way she cocked one hip as she barreled across my turf. Her grin wasn't the apologetic smirk of someone who's made a mistake. It was the small, satisfied curve of a person who thinks the world exists to validate her whims. That morning, coffee in hand and heart pounding, I realized this wasn't random. It wasn't a delivery driver. It was Evelyn March taking my lawn, day after day, like it was her personal thoroughfare. The first time I noticed the marks, they were two timid lines in the grass, faint as if someone had dragged a rake. Early March had left the soil soft, the kind of earth that remembers everything it lets in. Feet, paw prints, tire tread. I stood on the porch, the day cold enough to sharpen my spine, and ran a hand over those furrows. For a second, I tried rationalizing. Maybe a lost driver, a prank, a mistake. Then the next morning they were back. A fresh gouge, mud flung across the sidewalk, an angry crescent where the mower used to make obedient stripes. By the third morning, it wasn't a pattern. It was a timetable. The tracks appeared between 7:15 and 7:30 every day. Rain, sun, weekday, weekend. The schedule did not bend. Whoever was doing it had a routine. That kind of regularity isn't happenstance. It's deliberate, and it's personal. This was my lawn. I tended it like work and worship. Mowing, edging, fertilizing, keeping the lines sharp. It was my small act of order in a world keen on sliding toward chaos. Seeing it torn up the way someone claws at a fresh canvas felt like more than vandalism. It felt like an insult. HOA neighborhoods are strange theaters. The set is flawless from the curb. Manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, polite waves. Behind the scenes, there's political theater, pettiness, jockeying, petty sanctions that escalate to petty cruelties. When I mentioned the tire marks to neighbors while walking my dog, I got polite shrugs. People heard me, but they didn't act. In that silence, I felt something colder. Everyone probably knew, and everyone was pretending not to. I couldn't stake out the lawn every morning. Life and work demanded normal rhythms, so I bought a motion-activated security camera in a 2 a.m. YouTube ad haze. 6 megapixels, night vision, a 90-degree field, $39. I mounted it above the mailbox and told myself it was for peace of mind. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold, and scrolled through the camera app. At 7:20, the footage flickered. Headlights, the wide silhouette of an SUV, the chrome catching the streetlight. And then, Evelyn March, sunglasses down, a coffee cup in the holder, a grin that looked as practiced as the HOA form she signed. The SUV cut across the lawn with a casualness that felt theatrical, as if performing a private ritual in a public place. I watched the clip again and again. In one short, grainy minute, she turned my front yard into a thoroughfare with the same patience someone uses to water a bonsai. I had the proof. For the first time, the crime felt real. Undeniable. One clip isn't always enough, especially when the offender is a person who knows how to bend narratives. Evelyn was not just a resident. She was the president of the association for 3 consecutive terms, chairing committees, issuing directives, wielding the HOA like a ceremonial mace. If I brought a single clip to a meeting, she'd brush it off. Camera artifacts, misidentification, a joke. If I filed a complaint, she could find ways to reroute it into oblivion. So I collected more. I placed a second camera on the opposite side of the yard, repositioned angles, saved clips with petty file names. The Royal Shortcut, Suburban Surprise, Episode 3, Mud Ballet. Monday, She crested the lawn at 7:19, mud arcing behind the tires. Tuesday. The car slowed so she could look directly at my house and wave as if to greet an admiring crowd. Wednesday. Music blaring, windows down, one hand on the wheel, the other draped in morning arrogance. It was a highlight reel of contempt. At the monthly community cleanup, when people pretended to enjoy raking with the performative cheer of extras in a commercial, I waited until Evelyn was within speaking distance. She was in a pastel cardigan, clipboard a scepter under her arm. The neighborhood's gossip neurons fired as I approached. Eyes turned, wait for it. "Evelyn," I said, keeping my voice level. "Do you have a minute?" She smiled the way a queen smiles at a court jester. "Mark," she said. "Of course. How can I help?" Everyone around us heard the exchange, and that gave her power. I told her about my lawn. I told her about the marks. For a beat, I thought there'd be a crack in her armor, an apology or a denial so sheepish it would suffice. Instead, she laughed. An airy sound that might have floated away if it didn't cut. "Mark," she said, "it's just grass. It grows back." I told her I had footage. Her face didn't shift. Instead, she tilted her head and said those words you learned to dread. "I'm the HOA president, Mark. Maybe you're mistaken. Cameras can be faulty." That was the thin end of the wedge. Then the mask slipped. Her smile thinned. "I'm on the board," she said, leaning in. "If you keep making trouble, you're only making things difficult for yourself." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, delivered with the guile of someone who knows how to control the narrative. She turned away and started assigning chores to teenagers, acting as though nothing had happened. The crowd dissolved back into the week's business, and I left with the rake feeling like an insult. Instead of shame, Evelyn escalated. She began to slow on the lawn, giving me the time to see her face. She waved in a way that felt like a declaration. "I can do this, and I will." The tire tracks deepened into ravines. One morning, her bumper clipped my mailbox and left the post leaning like a bowed sentinel. The HOA letters began to arrive. First a nitpick about my lawn's texture, then a warning about hedges, then a ridiculous citation about a trash bin being left out. It had been out 30 minutes after collection. Every letter was signed with the same hand that drove over my grass. She used the HOA as a weapon. The association became the conduit for petty revenge. Where once it aimed to protect property values, it now aimed to weaponize rules. The sameness of it, the cadence of letters, the bureaucratic tone, made my chest ache. The woman who told others to tidy their mailboxes was stomping across mine. Instead of shame, Evelyn escalated. She began to slow on the lawn, giving me the time to see her face. She waved in a way that felt like a declaration. "I can do this, and I will." The tire tracks deepened into ravines. One morning, her bumper clipped my mailbox and left the post leaning like a bowed sentinel. The HOA letters began to arrive. First a nitpick about my lawn's texture, then a warning about hedges, then a ridiculous citation about a trash bin being left out. It had been out 30 minutes after collection. Every letter was signed with the same hand that drove over my grass. She used the HOA as a weapon. The association became the conduit for petty revenge. Where once it aimed to protect property values, it now aimed to weaponize rules. The sameness of it, the cadence of letters, the bureaucratic tone, made my chest ache. The woman who told others to tidy their mailboxes was stomping across mine, the turning point. For a long time, I believed civility was the fastest route to resolution. Be reasonable. The system will correct itself. But Evelyn March's contempt taught me that civility is a language manipulators use to disarm you while they stack the deck. After one particularly humiliating letter, I had enough. The person who thought she could intimidate me into silence hadn't counted on two things. I kept notes, and I was not good at being cowed. One midnight I sat, the house dim, and watched the clips again, not out of obsession, but to assemble a coherent case. Her route, the times, her gestures, the same smug wave. I spoke aloud to the empty room. "All right, Evelyn. You want to play? Fine." It was not about revenge as much as reclaiming what she'd taken. I wanted to remove her privilege to dismiss the harm she'd caused. The strategy I decided to be careful, precise, legal, and creative. I could have gone straight to authorities. Trespass is trespass. But Evelyn had cultivated allies in the board and in the neighborhood. A single report could be deflected as neighbor trouble. So I built something harder to deny: a pattern, a dossier, testimony, and public exposure. If she was going to weaponize the HOA, I'd use transparency. First, I compiled the footage into a clear timeline, labeled and time-stamped. I printed stills showing the SUV's tire path and the way it matched the damage. I documented the dates of HOA letters and matched them to the days following the worst offenses. Second, I began talking to neighbors in a different, quieter way. The polite shrugs had turned into curious glances. A few admitted they'd noticed but feared getting involved. As I explained the pattern, voices softened from apathy to unease. A woman 2 doors down said she'd seen Evelyn carve my yard once and assumed it was emergency access. Another neighbor admitted Evelyn had been pushy in the past. Finally, I scheduled my own neighborhood mailer, a factual, calm, non-accusatory leaflet that laid out the facts, dates, times, and the damage. No insults, no inflammatory language, just documented evidence that an elected HOA official was repeatedly driving across private property. I slipped the leaflets into mailboxes late at night. It felt small but honest. The new light. That evening, over dinner, the mood in the neighborhood shifted like weather. People discussed the leaflets. An old man who usually kept to himself came by and said, "You did the right thing." The HOA email thread lit up with questions. For once, the stink of assumed authority got scrubbed by daylight. Evelyn responded to nothing directly at first. The strategy worked better than I expected. Transparency muzzled the fiction she made for herself, but she wasn't done. Instead of denying, she pivoted toward performance. Dozens of little projects cropped up: sign installations, improvements, community notices, all under her signature. It was a distraction campaign meant to drown the facts with noise. This only proved one thing more: she was running scared. The board meeting, at the next HOA meeting, the room smelled of cheap coffee and ego. Evelyn was there in her pastel armor, but she was smaller, more guarded. When I stood to speak, my voice was steady. I presented the clips, the timeline, the letters. I did not plead. I spoke in sequences. Here is a timestamp, here is the footage, here is the damage. I did not ask for vengeance. I asked for remedy. I offered to have a landscaper repair the damage it caused, and I requested the board make a statement that trespassing would not be tolerated, irrespective of rank. The room watched. Evelyn's mask faltered. Her allies whispered. The board chairman cleared his throat, and under pressure, agreed to an impartial review. The motion passed by a narrow margin. Public accountability was an ugly, clumsy thing when a bully runs it, but it was a start. Small victories, bigger battles. The board's statement was weak. It did not name her, and it couched things in passive voice. But it existed. Public records began to shift. The HOA could no longer entirely protect a person who'd been caught on camera. My mailbox citations ceased for a while. The board shifted its focus to community standards, without specifying who broke them. Evelyn's behavior changed in small, revealing ways. She stopped the brazen morning drives for a few weeks, only to return with different angles and a less obvious path. The liability was still there. The entitlement hadn't died. I continued to collect footage and to talk to neighbors. Law and shaming aren't perfect tools, but used together they're harder to ignore. Fighting bureaucracy, even for the right reasons, is a grind. There were nights I tossed and paced, days I replayed clips instead of doing my job, weekends spent meeting with landscapers and neighbors. The strain was real. The shame was mine to manage as much as, or more than, anybody else's. People enjoy drama in small flavors, a scandal to spice the coffee break. But the truth is, the fight for dignity is noisy and exhausting. Still, I kept at it because the alternative was letting someone believe they could bulldoze another person's life with impunity about 2 months into the campaign for accountability. A new piece of evidence arrived by way of an unlikely ally. One morning, a jogger knocked on my door, out of breath and voyeuristic. She had a short clip of Evelyn cutting across my lawn while on a phone call, a different angle that showed the license plate for a few seconds. We combined that with my footage, and suddenly identifying the vehicle owner became simple. Public records linked Evelyn to the plate. The board could no longer feign ignorance about who the driver was. The case was clearer than ever. Confrontation in public is an awkward thing. The board called for a formal meeting and asked Evelyn to attend. She did, wearing neat composure, but her statements were fractured. Half apology, half blame shift. The people she had once cowed looked at her differently now. The room where she once stood as unquestioned arbiter was now populated by witnesses. I did not expect a cinematic collapse. No dramatic confession or televised fall. Real life resolves in small legal nudges, a formal warning, an agreement to pay for lawn restoration, a nomination to step down that didn't pass but lost its sheen. Evelyn agreed in writing to avoid my property and to allow restorative repairs. A landscaper from a local nursery resodded the torn ruts and replaced the upended mailbox. The lawn took its time to recover. New grass needed seasons and patience, just as neighborhood trust did. Some neighbors apologized, or at least stopped pretending they didn't know. Others stayed quiet, fearful of entanglement. Evelyn continued to be part of the association for a while, but her swagger diminished. She still complained about petty things, still found rules a fine instrument, but her blunt arrogance became tempered by the memory of being watched. Step 16. Lessons in public and private power. The thing I learned, painfully, is that authority without accountability is a slow toxin. People who hunger for control will find the levers, meetings, memos, fine print. But accountability is contagious. Once you document a pattern, once others see you will not be simply shouted down, the weight shifts. The world does not end in victory, but quiet restitution is often better than spectacle. I also learned the art of calibrated resistance. There's a difference between lashing out, which fuels a manipulator, and strategic, persistent action. Time, evidence, community, and maintaining a calm public demeanor are tools. They are not dramatic, but they work. In the months after the lawn was repaired, I spent mornings not on the vigil, but on the mower. Repairing those stripes became a private ritual, a way to signal to myself that the small things matter. The grass responded slowly, then suddenly. New green shot up where brown had been, and the lawn regained its lines. Evelyn's SUV still glinted sometimes at intersections, a reminder of how close things had gotten. But the arrogance was thinner. She still saw herself as steward, but that stewardship was more performative than absolute. The neighborhood, too, became just slightly less brittle. Conversations changed from gossip to practicalities, and the petty sanctimony faded. I'd said, in those early black nights, that I wanted revenge. Time taught me that revenge is seldom satisfying. The truest victory was not humiliating Evelyn or making her leave with her dignity in tatters. It was reclaiming the small, ordinary things she had taken. My peace, my property, my sense that rules applied equally. That reclamation felt like gentle triumph. If a story has a moral, and I hate morals slapped like medals on novels, it might be this. Power without transparency decays into contempt. Confrontation, when measured and documented, becomes a safeguard. And the quiet, tedious work of gathering facts, rebuilding, and getting neighbors to listen is often the